Ian Bremmer, let me turn to you. Obviously, the expectations for this meeting were pretty low, but the fact that Secretary Blinken met with China's president is significant in and of itself. What is your biggest takeaway from what happened today?
That the diplomacy is good and the relationship is bad. I mean, there's no question if you compare this to when Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken were first meeting their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage, and the Chinese lectured at the Americans and stormed off. This was a much better trip, no question. But you have the Chinese engaging in the last several weeks in very assertive, even belligerent military activities towards the Americans in the Straits of Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and still refusing to re-engage in high-level military-to-military contacts for the two countries. You see the Americans having changed the status quo, not diplomatically, but the real status quo between the U.S. and China, in saying that Taiwan is not going to matter as much anymore, that there are big export controls on Taiwanese semiconductors, and meanwhile, massive investment away from Taiwan into the United States, into American allies. So the Americans may be saying that they're not pushing Taiwanese independence, but they are structurally trying to make Taiwan as unimportant as possible, changing that status quo from China's perspective. Neither of those two things are likely to change in the next couple months. So I do think that we're going to see a Xi Jinping meeting with Biden. We might see a quick Zoom call. It's very likely, if there isn't a crisis, that Xi will come to San Francisco for the APEC summit, where Biden intends to be for 2 days in the fall. But none of that is really changing the reality that this relationship is fraught with conflict. There is zero trust in it, and it's actually quite dangerous.
Yeah, and there has been, I think, a lot of talk about a potential meeting on the sidelines of the summit that you mentioned, Ian. Really good point there. What do you make of the fact that China and the U.S. said today that they are not having military-to-military communication channels reopened yet? How significant is that to basically not allowing this thaw to move forward?
Well, it's a lever, and it's one of the few things that the Chinese have that the Americans really want, that it's fairly easy for them to continue to take away. And the Americans have been pressing on this. I mean, as you probably know, the military-to-military contacts really stopped after Nancy Pelosi went to Taipei last fall. This was despite the fact that Biden really didn't want her to go. But the Americans were quite surprised when the U.S. put those export controls on semiconductors going to China. They were surprised that the Chinese didn't do very much in response, that there wasn't a tit-for-tat sanctioning against the Americans. There wasn't much the Chinese felt like they could do. Well, here we have something that the Americans want that the Chinese are not offering. And I think China's response is, if you're not going to play ball with us on export controls and what we consider a level playing field, we're not going to play ball with you. We're willing to tolerate more danger in the relationship. It's not exactly linkage because they're in very different areas of the relationship, but they see it from the same perspective.
There's obviously been a lot of focus on the tariffs that were imposed under former President Trump. Do you expect any movement on that? Do you think that the president is considering lifting some of those tariffs?
He was considering it. In fact, there was a report that I remember the Secretary of Treasury gave to Biden, was asked by the White House of how much would it reduce inflation if the Trump-era tariffs on the U.S. and China were removed. In other words, and then it was reciprocal from the Chinese. And the response was about 1% off of inflation. Now, of course, this was back when inflation was a lot higher and was considered to be a very significant problem for Biden's popularity and for the U.S. economy. Now, if he was unwilling to do it then, because he would be pilloried as being too soft on China, particularly by the Republicans in the House and Senate, he's certainly not going to do it now when inflation feels more manageable, more under control, less of an urgent political crisis.
Let me ask you, one interesting point from the interview, I thought, is that Secretary Blinken told Janice Mackey Frayer that the Chinese spy balloon chapter should be closed. Do you agree with that? What's your assessment?
Well, they didn't want it to be opened. Let's keep in mind that the Americans knew that the balloon was coming over the United States well before it was noticed by members of the public and then blew up in the internet and on the media. And at that point, they were still fully intending to send Tony Blinken to China to meet with Xi Jinping. And it was only when it became public that suddenly the chapter was opened. It was only when it became public that suddenly it became imperative to shoot the balloon down. I fully expect the Chinese are going to continue with their balloon surveillance program. The purpose of it is to have a backup that's not as effective as their satellite-based surveillance, but in case the Americans in a conflict were to blow up China's capabilities, they have something they can continue to watch and engage. You've, of course, seen the recent headlines on China's surveillance program with a base in Cuba, which first the Biden administration was a little wishy-washy on, squirrely, and then they said, well, actually, it's been going on since 2019. Read, since the Trump administration. I mean, is that chapter closed? This is not something they want to talk about, but it is, in reality, another area of tit for tat between the Americans and Chinese. Let's be very clear. The Chinese have far greater surveillance capabilities. The Americans have far greater surveillance capabilities of the Chinese surrounding and above China than anything the Chinese can put in the field right now.
All right. Ian Bremmer, thank you so much for joining us on a very busy day. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.